Hello, everyone. Welcome to DotVVM Community Meetup. It's my pleasure to be here. It's the first meetup after the DotVVM virtual conference where we presented the news we have been working on for DotVVM 4.0 and also some things that we will start for DotVVM 5. And today I will be showing one of the features that will be part of DotVVM 5.0, and it's called Auto UI. The previous name of this thing was Dynamic Data, but we were thinking that Auto UI might be a better name than just Dynamic Data, which is the name took from ASP.NET Web Forms times. So I hope that it will work. I'm seeing that all of the attendees of this call are familiar with DotVVM, so I don't have to tell many things about it. But for the people who will be watching the recording, I just want to remind that DotVVM is an open source framework which can help with building new web applications using the model view model approach. So if you are familiar with WPF or Xamarin or other MVVM framework, then you will find DotVVM very easy to use. And if you want to use DotVVM on some older projects, you can. DotVVM can be installed in all web forms applications, and you can use this framework to modernize your application incrementally. So you can spend a couple of weeks or maybe months by rewriting the SPX pages into DotVVM, and the projects will still be working. And after that, you can migrate it to .NET Core or .NET 6 or whatever is the newest version of .NET. So today I will be showing some demos of DotVVM Auto UI, which was previously called DotVVM Dynamic Data. And basically, it's a library which can auto-generate user interface from your data model. So if you imagine that you have a database and generate some C# model using Entity Framework, for example, then you can use these C# models to also define some rules from which the user interface will be generated. And in DotVVM, we had a library called Dynamic Data, which was supporting auto generation of UI, but it had a lot of problems. One thing is that it wasn't integral part of the framework, so it wasn't the first-class citizen in DotVVM. Sometimes it took us a couple of days or weeks until we released the new version for the new version of DotVVM, and now it's hosted in as part of DotVVM repo. So whenever we publish a new version of DotVVM, the Auto UI library and also Dynamic Data will be published together with that. For the compatibility purposes, we will be also keeping the dynamic data packages, but for new apps, we recommend to migrate to Auto UI. Of course, right now, it's not published on NuGet. I will be showing it from the .vvm code base, but it should be part of some future preview. And we will be definitely writing a blog post and making some videos about this because it's a very interesting package. DotVVM Dynamic Data was working mostly on the runtime. So it was using reflection, and basically it scanned the C# class you are trying to display, and based on some data attributes on the C# properties, it was generating the UI. The problem was that this was doing at the runtime. So for every HTTP request, there were a lot of reflection calls, which wasn't very fast. And also, there wasn't very good debugging experience. Some of the APIs wasn't designed in a good manner. So we have decided to create a second package with different namespace, different package name. The principles of the components are still the same, but it's not backwards compatible. Some controls will be looking differently. So if you have been using dynamic data, you can migrate to Auto UI, but there will probably be some breaking changes because there are some new features and also some features which we are not supporting or which we are doing in a different way. So basically, Auto UI can generate forms. It can generate columns in the grid views, and maybe we will be adding support for generating other kinds of content, for example, some list of cards with images or some auto-generating filters on top of the grid view or things like that. So we will see where the feedback of the community will lead us, actually. So basically, Auto UI works with the model metadata. Basically, if you are binding any C# class as your view model or as an object in your view model, Auto UI will look at attributes on properties of these classes, and it will try to infer a lot of things. For example, what is the label of the field? You want the user to write the email address or something like that. So you want the label on the form field to be like email address, or it can be localized to other languages. So you want to specify the label for the field, maybe some description, display format. You want to specify what kind of field it is. Maybe it's a string property, so you would expect a text box control for editing this field, but it can be a multi-line text box, or it can be password field. Also, the metadata can provide some styling information, like not exactly CSS styles, like make this red, but maybe something like this field is more important than the others, so it should be bigger or more intense or something like that. You can also define what we call UI hints, because sometimes there can be multiple choices how the user can edit this property. If it will be a list of some categories, then shall we display like a bunch of checkboxes for all the categories, or would some other component with maybe some search capabilities could be more useful to the user? So you can, whenever Auto UI will have multiple decisions, what control can be used for editing the specific property, you can specify a UI hint that will tell, okay, this list probably will be large, so I want search, for example. Yeah, and you can define your own UI hints, and you can define your own editors. So you may very easily make preferences about what control will be used for this specific property. And also, we want to work with relationships because in many cases, you need the user to pick from some other table. Like I'm editing address, so I want to specify what country is in the address. So we have introduced a concept of a thing called selections. So when you have the address model object, there will probably be some country ID property. And then you can say, OK, this ID will be selected from a list of countries. And here is a service which can give you the list of countries, maybe with search and other capabilities. And you can apply these metadata instructions on an individual property using .NET attributes, or you can apply them by convention. So for example, you can say that for every property which contains, I don't know, customer ID in its name, we will be using this editor with this kind of selections, and we will be using this service for making the selection. So that's how you can apply the metadata. I will have just a few slides, and then we will look in the code because it's already working. So for example, if you want to specify the label for the fields, there is a display attribute. It's part of .NET. It's been there for a very long time. You can specify label. You can say, OK, I want this field in the form, or I don't want it. So you can say auto-generate field. You can also assign groups to fields. So if it's some large entity with several sections, you can specify the group name. And then, for example, if you want to render like multiple columns, each group in separate columns, you will be able to distinguish the fields by the group name. And you can also specify custom ordering. If you don't say the order, by default, the order will be the same as you have declared the properties in your C# class. So it's pretty natural. But if you want to like have different ordering, you can override that basically. There is a data type which is useful for passport fields or for some long descriptions where you want the user to have multiple lines to edit. For example, then we have data format string. So if you are I don't know if I will be showing the date times in a grid view. I can say, okay, I'm only interested in date information, so I can specify my own data format string. There is also visible and enabled attributes, which are not part of the framework, that are custom. It comes from .vvm Auto UI. And you can basically conditionally like include or exclude fields based on the user information. So for example, if the user is signed in or if it's just an anonymous user, or based on the role membership. So, okay, you can say that, okay, this field will be edited only by admin users or something like that. Also, you may be using the same entity in multiple pages, like once in a grid page and then in some detail page with a form fields. So you can define your own views, and then you can say, okay, this field is relevant only for the detail view, not for the grid, for example. The same applies to enabled, basically. You can also say, okay, this field will be visible, but it will not be editable. The style attribute is also custom. It comes from Auto UI, and you can apply CSS classes to fields and grid columns for that specific property. And we have a selector attribute, or maybe there is a bug. Sorry, there is a bug in the slides because I have renamed it a selection in 2 days ago, so I forgot to update this in the slides. So the attribute selection, and here you specify the type of the selection. And this is important. I'm used to make a convention that, for example, this will be named like country selection or customer selection, product selection. And basically this type is just a record with 2 fields like ID and the text, nothing special. And actually it has to inherit from a selection item record, which we provide in the framework. It's generic, so you can say, okay, my ID will be GUID or string or integer or anything. And then you need to register iSelection provider of this object. And it's a service that can provide the list of items to select from. So, for example, when I will have a country ID property in my class, in my entity class, I can decorate it with the selection attribute, and I can say it will be country selection. And then I will provide a service that can give me a list of all countries. And I'm just registering this into the default dependency injection container. So like the framework will pick it up from there. And of course, this service can have other dependencies as well. And the last thing, there is the UI hint. So if there is multiple choices, if you implement your own editors for properties, and the framework would have multiple choices which editors could work with this type of property, then you can specify UI hint, oh, please use this kind of editor. And the editor can also like say, oh, I'm supporting these UI hints. So if this is match, it will have greater priority, basically. And we have also Fluent API, so you don't need to specify it with attributes. You can specify conventions. So when you are registering Auto UI in .vvm Startup, you can say, okay, for all properties where the name ends with image URL, we will be using UI hint attribute with the hint image. Yeah, so you can define any rule for any property or group of properties. And if you follow some conventions or create your own conventions for naming, then it's very, very interesting. Like if you have some user role, which can, for example, never see the prices, then you can say, okay, if the property name contains the word price, then I will be hiding all these fields for some specific role of users. And if you follow that convention, then every property which displays the price will actually have the price string in its name, then this convention will work very nice, very well. We also support localization, so you can provide a resx file with names of properties in the model. So like, for example, account name, account number, and wherever the property is named like that, it will use the value from the resource file. So this is in the Czech language, but you can also have other versions of this ResX file. And based on the user's culture, the appropriate strings will be picked up from the resource file. So if you want to start using Auto UI, then we have several components there. First is Auto Editor, and it's basically an editor for a single field. So you specify just the property, and it will look at the type of property, and based on that, it will pick the correct editor. And also it can look at the attributes with the UI hints. So for example, if it's a string, we will use text box. If it's a Boolean, we will use checkbox. If it's enum, that it's very nice because we can, and previous dynamic data couldn't, and now Auto UI can just infer a combo box with the values for each individual enum item. So it's also quite nice. And if it's a collection of some scalar values, for example, integers or strings or things like that, then DotVVM Auto UI will render a collection of checkboxes. And basically, if the user selects some checkboxes, the appropriate IDs will be added into this collection. This needs the selection attribute. Otherwise, the framework wouldn't know from which objects you want to select. So I will need to decorate this property with the selection attribute. If you want to generate a form, then you can use auto form. And what is in the data context is the input for this control. So it will look at this customer object, and for every property, it will generate the field. And we have several versions of the form, like we have Bootstrap form for Bootstrap CSS, and also my colleague likes the CSS framework called Bulma. So he added a Bulma form. We are not sure if this will be a separate NuGet package or if it will be just included in the framework, but you can also implement your own forms. Basically, all the logic, like decide which editor will be used, it's provided by Auto UI, and you can just create a simple control that will get this information, and it will just emit the correct hierarchy of HTML elements with appropriate CSS classes. So it will look like a nice form. Basically, this form can also is extensible. You can respond to changed events for every property. So for example, there is a country changed event if there is some country property. So you will be able to respond to these events. And you can also filter the properties by group name and view name. So for example, if this customer has a lot of properties, you can say, okay, render only the group basic information. And then you can use another form, and you can say in some other place of the screen, and you can say, okay, here, give me like other properties and things like that, the other section of the form, basically. Yeah. So we have also Bootstrap form, which will generate a Bootstrap compatible hierarchy of elements with the fields. So it would look Bootstrap. And if you are using GridView, you can use auto GridView columns, and it will look at the data source of the GridView, and it will also emit all the columns for this entity. So it basically replaces itself with the columns. So if you have any other columns in the GridView, they will remain there. So you can add your own columns to these auto-generated ones. So let's see the demo. I have a simple application here. And let's look at the project structure first. So it's a normal standard DotVVM application. And in my DotVVM startup, I have registered, I'll make this a little bit bigger. I have registered Auto UI framework. So basically, what I'm doing here is auto-discovering my own custom providers, because I have written some extensions for the framework, but this is optional. If you don't want to extend Auto UI, then you don't need these two lines. And I'm specifying a convention. So for all properties where its name ends with image URL, I'm using this UI hint. So this is just my basic conventions. If I don't have localization here, but if I would like localize this application, I could say something like property display names resource file equals type of my resources or something like that. And if this would be the resource file, then the framework would use this resource file to generate labels for the properties. There are other options as well, but not many of that, basically. Just these few things. So this is the configuration. You need to have these NuGet packages of Auto UI, and you need to configure it in .vvm startup. And then you can just start using this this library. So for example, let's first look at the login screen, because it's very very simple. And as you can see, there is the form element. There is some button which will submit the form, the validation summary, and the entire form is done just by this one line of code, like auto bootstrap form, and the data context for the form is model. And now let's look at the model page, model object, and you can see that it's sign-in model. And this class is using some data annotations attributes. So I'm providing all the metadata which are required to build the form. So for example, I have the display attribute here. So this field will be named username. This will be named password, and this will be remember sign in. I have a validation here, so both fields are required. And because this is a password, I need to tell in the metadata language that this is a password field. So in the page, the password field would be used. So I'm saying the data type equals to data type password. So let's run this application. I hope that it will work. I'm using preview version of the Visual Studio. And let's try to sign in. And you can see this is rendered by the Bootstrap form control. Yeah, so it took the labels provided in the metadata and it generated the fields. And this is normal text box. This is the password field. So let's sign in. And that's it. Like the rest of the view model is just normal.vvm thing. So there is a method sign in. I'm using this like account service to sign the user in, which will verify the passport and things like that. I'm using validation. So if the credentials are not correct, I will attach a validation error on this model object. So it will be displayed by the validation summary control, basically. And that's it. So this is the first page. This is how I generated the form. So let's look at this new sections that appeared here. So for example, let's start with locations. And you can see it's a very simple grid view, and it's also auto-generated. So let's look at this location list page. And you can see there is just a button which leads to a new page. And here I have the grid view control with two template columns. These are basically this edit and remove button. These are not auto-generated. I have added them manually. And this is auto grid view columns, which will also look in the locations collection. And for each property of the object, it will generate my columns. There is one tiny bug here. DotVVM doesn't remove this auto generate grid view columns. So this column, it's a relic of the auto generation. We already have a fix, but I don't have the latest version of .vvm here in this app. So this extra column shouldn't be there. And in the production release, of course, it won't be there. It's empty, but it's some like relic of this, because this column basically replaces itself with the auto-generated columns. But for some reason, it stays here. So let's look at the location object, location list model. And you can see that I have set auto-generate field to false on ID. So that's why the ID column is not generated at all. And here I have the location name, address, city, zip code, country name, and number of meetups in this location. So basically, that's all the columns that are generated here. And I could provide more metadata, for example, some styling information and things like that. but this is a very simple thing. And also, if I would be using the resource files, I would not have to use these display attributes because I would have the names specified, the label text specified in my resource file. So this code would be even a bit cleaner. The backend of this is not very interesting. I have some location service, which is using Entity Framework, and it just gives me these location list models. I'm not a fan of using just the location object from the Entity Framework in the view models because it may contain some properties that I don't want to expose to the user. So that's why I'm using this select, and I'm basically projecting the Entity Framework entities to my custom models with this metadata. Let's look at the detail of the location, but it's nothing special. It looks exactly the same as the sign-in page. There is just the Bootstrap form, validation summary, and some buttons. So nothing special here. But if you try to edit, you can see also this, this form looks like this. What's interesting here is the selection of countries, because I have a countries table in my database. So you can see these properties are boring because it's just strings. Some of them are required, but that's it. And here, this country ID is a nullable integer. It's marked as required, so the user at the end of the day, he has to select the country. Without selecting the country, the validation will not proceed. But here I'm saying this is a selection of some country selection objects. And if you look in the definition of country selection, it's just a record which derives from selection of integer. And this selection, it's basically a record which is part of .vvm framework. By the way, we made a nasty hack here because we have a selection record, but it doesn't have the type of the key. And we didn't want anyone to be able to inherit from this non-generic version of the selection class. And in C# you can add a private protected member here, which means that this class can be inherited, but if you inherit it from your own assembly, you will not be able to provide implementation for this method. So the compiler will not allow you to inherit this class in your own assembly. But we provide implementation for this method here in the generic version, so you will be required to inherit from this generic version. Yeah. So this is a hack because we didn't want people to use the non-generic version. We always need to know the type of the key, but on some places we are using this non-generic version internally. So that's a bit hack, but it works. Yeah, so I'm deriving from selection of integer, which is permitted, and nothing else here. It's just a record. It just has the display name, which will be displayed to the user, and the key, which is the primary key of the selected thing. And here I have service which implements iSelection provider of country selection. And the purpose of this class is to give the framework the list of all the countries. So basically here in the get selector items, I'm also using entity framework to give me a sorted list of this country selection object. So you can say I'm specifying the value and the display name, and that's it. So this service provides the list of countries, and wherever you will use this selection attribute, .vvm will generate a selection with these countries. So this list is provided by the service, and you can select from this list. So that's it. And you can apply this by convention. So for example, if I know that on all the places where I need to select countries, the property name would end with country ID, then I can register this by convention. Which is, I really like to do these things. Yeah. So yeah, there is another requirement. You need to have this thing in your view model. If you don't have, the control will throw an error. But you just need to provide a view model for this combo box because it needs to persist the list of countries somewhere. So basically, you just include a property of type selection view model of country selection and just initialize it. Don't do anything else with that. Just initialize it, and it's done. It's everything you need. So that's it, and that's how this page works actually. So just bootstrap form, and you can see it can generate form even with selection from other tables. So let's look here. It's similar. It's also like a form, but you can see this form is a bit more complicated. So let's look how this works. And first, let's deal with the images. Because there is in the Meetup entity, I can show you the model. Here I have the image URL, and it contains basically a relative path to the image of the Meetup. And I want to display it as an image. And of course, this is some customized thing. Every image can be different in the application. So I have extended Auto UI with my own grid column provider. Basically, for every property, you can build your own grid column provider, which can tell the GridView how this property will be rendered. So I have created image grid column provider. I have put here the UI hint image. We'll see in a few minutes why it's important. And basically, the provider needs to implement two methods. First is whether it can handle the property. So here you can make the validation. For me, the requirement is that the image URL has to be string. It must be string. If it's something else, I don't know how to render that. Yeah, so I'm making sure that it's string. And if it's string, I need to build the GridView column. So you can see I have just created a value binding from this property. I'm getting some context, Auto UI context here. And here is a method create value binding. So this will create a value binding for my property. Basically, this is creating this expression. So because you don't need you didn't know the name of the property here, but this will figure it out for you. And I'm returning GridView template column, and my template will be just an image element with src attribute equal to the value binding. It will contain the URL. So I'm binding the URL in the src attribute of this image element. And also, I'm binding the visible property. And here I am using the select method on the value binding to generate a derived binding from that. So this is basically this image URL. And I'm saying this image element will be visible when the image URL is not null. Because if the image is not is empty, then it would render the image loading thing from the browser. So I want to hide this when image URL is null. And when it's not null, so when it's not null, I'm rendering this image, and I'm also rendering this div, and it will be visible in the opposite case. So if there is no image, I will render div with CSS class image none, and it will generate using CSS. It will generate some like gray placeholder image of the same size. Yeah, so if I create a new meetup, for example, yeah, so it will basically render this thing for me. So I need to select the country, Czech Republic, and I have some problem here because it doesn't allow me to size. Sorry, I cannot do this right now. I have some bug in the application. It doesn't allow me to create the location, so I cannot show you this zero case. Maybe I can do it like this. So .vvm state. We can see we have the meetups collection here. State and meetups will be an array of the first object and the second object. So, and the first object, the image URL should be null. Hopefully I haven't made a mistake here. Oh, Field course undefined to type boolean. Okay. I will have to use the old syntax, I guess. No. This is the. Oh, there is items. Sorry. That's the issue. It's a GridView dataset. It's not just a list. So I have been too quick. So let's do this. Here in meetups, it cannot be array here. It must be items and like this. So I have deleted the image from the view model, and you can see it will show this div element with this CSS class. Sorry about this issue. I have some bug in the app, but you can see that here this div is visible and the image is hidden. And in the next row, there is the opposite case. So the image is visible and this div is hidden. So I have to render both versions and use the visible binding to show or hide the appropriate one. Okay, so that's it. And when I now look in the Meetup model to the image URL, there is just this display attribute, but I have set this convention here. So wherever a property name ends with image URL, I am giving a UI hint image. And because this image grid column provider has this UI hint, it will like prioritize it because the hint on the property and in the provider is matching. So this image grid column provider will be used for this property. Otherwise, if there is no hint, then a text box or text column will be rendered because the property is of type string. So it will use a default editor, default column for the string type. Okay. So if you want to like override the default editor, you need to use this UI hint. Yeah. And these UI hints can be like you can have multiple hints specified on the property. So if there is some other grid column provider which specifies more hints, or some, it will use the first grid column provider with at least one matching hint on both sides. So that's it. The same way you can write a form editor provider. It's different than GridView column, but basically for some kind of properties with some UI hints, you can generate your own editor. So it's extensible. You can build your own editors as you wish. Yeah. So let's look in the Meetup model. I'm also using these visible attributes here because in the grid view, I don't want to show the description. Yeah, so ID is hidden always because auto-generate field is false. Title is visible, and description is visible only in the view which is called edit. And here on this page, Meetup list, I'm saying to the grid view, to the grid view columns, that view name is list. So it will show either both properties which don't have any view name, and also it will show properties where view name is list. But if the view name is something else, the property will be hidden. So the description will be used only in the edit mode, but not in the list mode, basically. Then there is the image. Then we have the begin date, end date, country ID, and also you can see it's visible only in the edit mode, not in the list mode. On the other hand, the country name, which is a string, it's displayed in the grid mode actually, in the list view. And location ID, it's the same. This is because I'm reusing the same Meetup model for grid and for the detail. I could split it to two classes, and then I wouldn't need to use these attributes. But because quite a lot of things were the same, I want to show how to reuse the same model class. It's up to you if you want to have one common model for listing and for edit, or if you prefer having two separate models. It's up to you. You can decide, and you have the tools to do this by this visible property. Also, you can show and hide fields based on user roles. So I could say roles administrator, for example, or I can say anonymous users or is authenticated equals authentication mode anonymous non-authenticated, and it means that this will be visible only for the users which are not authenticated. So, for example, and only in the edit mode. Yeah, so you can combine these things as you wish. Yeah, I'm also providing my own validation because begin date cannot be greater than the end date. Yeah, so I'm like implementing iValidateTable object. And the Meetup list page, you can see it's just this line, and it will generate all the columns for you. And in the Meetup detail, it's a bit more complicated because the form is more complicated, more complex. So let's see here. You can see there are two fields. Then I have this field for selecting the image, and I can like upload my own images. I hope that I have some good images here. So for example, this, and you can see the image changed, but this is the standard file upload component in DotVVM. And here I have two fields on the same row. So it's also quite interesting. And then here is the rest of the form, and it should work like that. When I change the country, this would be refreshed, but unfortunately it stopped working. However, I think it should work. I don't know why it's not working right now. But let's see. Maybe I will find the issue later. So how is this done? It's done by one simple trick. I have used multiple Bootstrap form entities. So basically, I have used Bootstrap form, and I said I only want to include these properties: title, description, or image URL. I could also do the same thing by using group name equals like first part. And then I would use the display attribute to say these three properties are in the first part of the form. So for example, so that's two ways you can decide which one you prefer. We are offering both ways, actually. So here I have explicitly listed the properties I want to generate. And because image URL, if I don't provide this template, the image URL would be just a text box because the property is string. Yeah? It just has some UI hint. But I haven't implemented any editor for this image URL. So I have provided my own template for image URL property. So if you want to override the template in a specific form, not globally in the app, but only in the specific form, you can use this editor template dash name of the property, and then provide your custom editor for the field. So I'm showing the thumbnail for empty image. I'm also showing the real image. It's the same logic as in the grid view, basically. And here I have the file upload, and it needs something in my view model. So I'm referencing something from the root of the view model, and there is a function process image which does all the resizing and storing the image. So it's a bit more complicated, but it's specific to this concrete page. So I didn't wrap it as a separate like form editor provider because it requires a lot of things from the view model where it's being used. Then I'm using div class row. It's a Bootstrap thing. So this is how I have done two columns in Bootstrap. And I'm using two tiny forms with just one property, begin date and end date. But I'm placing them here like side by side. So I can do this. I can use this Bootstrap form just for one property, no problem. And then I have the last Bootstrap form, which is for country ID and location ID. And I now see the problem. I have split the form. So the country ID property is not here, it's here. So when I put this changed country ID, then it will call this command and the location will be like refreshed. So let's see, when I change the country, you can see I have two locations here in Prague and Brno. And if I change the country for Germany, you can see there are other locations. So you can have cascading drop-down lists, and it's auto-generated. how is this magic done? Let's see the country ID and location ID property. So country ID is using the country selection. It's the same thing as we saw in the previous example. So this is just providing a list of countries to select, and I'm selecting the country. But here I am using location by country selection. And this is also a record of integer because the key here is also integer. But this iSelection provider has two generic arguments, location by country selection, and this is the parameter. And the parameter in this case is just integer, which represents the country ID. Maybe it's better not to place integer here, but to place some record like location by country filter or like country or something like that. But here I need just one integer, like give me all locations in a specific country. Yeah? So that's why it's int nullable here. And this nullability is here that if the country is not selected, I will just return an empty list because there is too many locations. I don't want to show all of them. So if it's not selected, I will be returning empty list. And user, please select country first, and then you will get the list of locations. And if the country ID is not null, then I'm returning locations filtered by this country. And this doesn't have to be integer, it can be an object, so you can filter by many other criteria, like just place an object here with 5 properties and use that for filtering the results. So you can specify a parameter and you will get this value here. And how this is used in the detail page, it's quite simple. When initializing this selection view model, location by country selection, and this is the type of the parameter, you need to provide a lambda that will provide the value for the parameter. So I'm initializing this selection view model, and I'm passing this lambda expression, and whenever the selection view model needs the parameter, it will call this lambda to provide it. So I'm saying, okay, look in the meetup.country ID, and there will be the country which is currently selected in the form. Yeah. And also this service is registered in the service provider. So like I don't have to do anything else, just declare the selection view model and initialize it in the constructor to provide the parameter value. So now I can also create the new location. I will just rebuild the app just to be sure that I have the right version right now. So I'm creating a new event. So my .vvm meetup. And here the times, I think this is okay. So first, and you can see the locations is not here because it gets an empty list. We decided that if the list is empty, we will not show this field at all. So I will select some location, and you can see, oh, I have a validation issue here because I forgot to transfer the validation enabled here because this form is triggering postbacks. So I'm putting validation enabled here, but just on the form, not on the button. So this save button will use validation, but this form, when it's making postbacks, it will not validate because like it can be in not non-consistent state. So once again, and here, when I select the country, now the locations appeared because it get some data. Yeah, so I have the location selected. Now, when I change it, you see that this is empty because the ID of the location is different. And here I'm using this thing. Here, this is important because whenever I change the country ID, then I need to tell the locations, oh, please, I need to refresh the selection. Otherwise, the locations would have no reason to like refresh the selection. We are trying to be efficient, so it will load only on the first postback or when it's explicitly asked. Yeah. So that's why I'm saying whenever the country ID changes, please refresh the locations. The selection view model here has this request refresh method, which will load the new version of the data. We have decided to use this request refresh pattern because if you change 5 properties in the form and the refresh is invoked 5 times, in reality it will be like invoked only once, because you just say, I want this field to be refreshed before the response is sent to the user, so it will be refreshed later. Yeah, it's some kind of like asynchronous API. So you only say, oh, please refresh this, but it will not be refreshed immediately. It will be refreshed in the pre-render phase of the page. But if you call this many times, it doesn't matter, because the database will be queried only once. Yeah, so that's why we try to design this API like this. So that's my application, and I haven't shown the enums. But if I would use enum in my model object somewhere, then you will see that the combo box with the enum entries would be generated automatically. What I can show you is the list of checkboxes. It's not styled very well, but basically when I say list of integers, and I say it's a selection of locations, and it's not a single integer, it's a selection of a list of integers, then it will generate checkboxes for all the locations, and I can check which locations are important to me. We will be changing the styling here because it doesn't look very nice. Of course, a bunch of CSS would fix it, but we want to render a better structure of these things, but it requires some changes in the framework and in the basic auto UI elements. And also, this is good when the list has like 10 items, but if it has like 100 items or something like that, then the users would probably need some search capabilities. So in such case, we will be using the UI hint. So for example, you will be able to say UI hint, and I don't know which hints we will use, but probably, for example, like we would not want the users to request a specific editor, but we would be preferring to define the capabilities or the requirements. So for example, I would say it should be searchable. Yeah, and it will try to find a provider which will give me an collection edit experience, but with some search capability. Yeah. And we will be creating auto UI extensions for .vvm business pack. So this will probably use the multi-select control, which has the search capabilities, or if you will be using or building your own set of controls, you can use these hints to indicate what features you need from the editor. So that is our idea behind the UI hints. It can also edit the collections. If I just uncheck something and save it and go here to the page, you can see the state is correctly persisted in the database, and everything is just here and in this location selection. I have these selection services here, so they are all using Entity Framework. The only thing you need to do is to register them in here in the service collection. So I have created my own extension method here, and I'm just using the Scrutor NuGet package, which can scan assemblies and find all the services. So basically, I'm taking all classes in this namespace services, and I'm registering them automatically as scoped. And also, I'm finding all selection providers with 1 or 2 generic arguments, and I'm registering them. So it's very convenient because I don't need to register the services individually. I just add classes here in the selection or services, and it will auto-register them for me. So this is also an approach I like very much. See the further plans of Auto UI, because we can generate the forms, but you may have noticed that most of the forms are the same. Like the sign-in form and this location detail form, you can see only the buttons are different, but otherwise it's the same. So why not to generate basically the entire page or larger pieces of pages. That's something that we are looking at, but it is getting more and more complicated because if you need enough extensibility points to be able to use it in real world applications, then it can be a bit more complicated to do. But definitely that's one direction we want to go in the future. So I hope that we will be able to provide something like that. Also, it's connected to generating also the business layer, because like I have been implementing these services and these are quite boring. It's a lot of boring code which could be like auto-generated because it's basically a CRUD. So like I'm looking at the table and just building some model from it. Here I'm finding one record and building some model from it. Here I'm saving. So if it has ID, I will be updating. Otherwise, I will be creating a new entity. And basically, you can take this class and copy paste it here and just replace location with Meetup, and that's it. Or maybe it could be done in a generic way. But like, why not to generate this? If I would be able to provide this mapping, because it's not exactly one-to-one. There are some like special things, but maybe with AutoMapper or some other library, it could be quite useful. Yeah, so that's what we are also looking at. And if we have more metadata about the structure of the application and hierarchy of the pages, we could also generate menus and provide some navigation within the application, like the breadcrumbs and things like that. So this is also an area where we are looking into. So that's basically that's it. If you are interested in the demo, the link will be published on YouTube under this video, or I will right now I will write the URL in the chat. So it's on GitHub. UI, there's no description, and there is a submodule because we don't have the packages yet. We are building .vvm from source code here, so make sure to run git submodule in it and git submodule update when you will be cloning this repo. Right now, we don't have NuGet packages with Auto UI, but we will have them soon once we merge this Auto UI branch into the main repo. So the link is in the chat and it will be published also under the video. So if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer. And if you have any suggestions, what features you would like in this framework, just let us know. We will be happy to talk about that. So no questions. Never mind. If you have any ideas later, just feel free to visit us on our Gitter chat or on the Stack Overflow or on any other places. If you go to our GitHub repo, you will see the link to the Gitter chat, and the team is there. So we will be happy to talk. So thank you for joining us today, and I will be happy to see you on some other events in the future. We are doing these meetups every month, every fourth Thursday in the month. So stay tuned and follow us on Twitter and on YouTube, because we are also publishing the recordings from these events here. So thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye.